Mexican Anthropology's Ongoing Search for Identity, Esteban Krotz. From a certain point of view, the history of anthropology seems to be one of the continual growth regarding the sociocultural phenomena, areas, and configurations under study, topics, and forums of debate, educational and research institutions, and analytical, methodological, and technical perspectives. In geographical terms, the correspondence concept would be that of extension from a small nucleus of specialists who emerged during the second half of the 19th century in Europe, a small peninsula of the Asian landmass, and what was then its North American prolongation. Anthropological practice has expanded to the point that today it is present in many parts of the world. Yet this manner of reconstructing the development of the discipline, though in certain sense justified, carries with it the danger of passing over anthropology's internal heterogeneity, its fractures and discontinuities, and of being unable to adequately take into account the emergence of new situations. One such novelty of recent decades, despite having begun in some cases considerably earlier, is the increasingly noticeable, relatively autonomous existence and reproduction of particular anthropological traditions in many countries of the South. These regions were previously considered solely or almost exclusively sites for the conduct of anthropological research generated in and directed by institutions located in the founding countries of the discipline. One of the first more important reflections on this topic took place during a Wintergren symposium held in 1978 called Indigenous Anthropology in Non-Western Countries, as Talal Asad pointed out in his contribution to the symposium volume. The existence of non-Western anthropologists, as they were called then, is not the same thing as the existence of non-Western anthropologies. And indeed, the character and properties of the so-called peripheral anthropologies or anthropologies of the South are yet to be defined. Yet how could it be supposed that the anthropological discipline created originally to study others who were so in relation to the industrialized, urbanized, and literate European world of the 19th century has not changed in some way after taking root various generations later in precisely those different cultures, and upon being utilized generally, though not always, for the study of those cultures' own internal others. This chapter is meant as a contribution to the clarification of the anthropologies of the South through the analysis of one of them, that of Mexico. By this means, I attempt to identify features that might be used in elaborating a new perspective on anthropology as a global discourse that entails an ensemble of paradigms, styles, practices, and forms of practical consciousness. To be able to adequately understand Mexican anthropology, it is necessary to examine the particularities of the national socio-political system of which it forms a part. The identity of this scientific discipline and professional practice in Mexico is profoundly rooted in the Mexican nation's own search for identity. For these reasons, I first discussed the relationship between the nation state and anthropology as one of the keys for understanding the makeup of an anthropological tradition, and I outline some of the principal features of contemporary Mexican society and its anthropology. In the next two sections, I reconstruct the historical development of Mexican anthropology, emphasizing its treatment of indigenous peoples as its internal others, and the dialect between the classes and culture, ending with a brief characterization of the most recent decade. In the final section, I describe a series of traits and intrinsic tensions between the intrinsic tensions in Mexican anthropologies today that might aid in comparing that anthropology with others of the South and North. The constituting factors of anthropological knowledge in Mexico. Although the origins of the present phase of globalization can be found in the 16th century, and although the first anthropological scientists constituted themselves as an international North Atlantic community in the second half of the 19th century, the nation state remains the most important organizer of anthropological activity. The nuances of the nation-state role depends on whether it belongs to the group of central peripheral countries and on its general historical, cultural, and linguistic background, to the degree that the nation-state, with its peculiar tendency toward homogenizing key aspects of life, also directs the legitimation of the social order in force. It sets the limits for, and on occasion directly intervenes in the generation of so-called scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge cannot be reduced to set a declarations constructed according to certain methodological prescriptions. Rather, it's immersed in shifting networks of relationships among institutions, among colleagues, with funding sources, with transmitters of knowledge, and with actual or potential users of the result of scientific investigations. These networks, as well as the ever-changing socio-political conditions that frame them, are not exterior to scientific knowledge, but rather are factors that help constitute it. A scientific tradition, or subdiscipline, defines itself principally through a specific question about reality, thereby grasping reality in a certain way. In the case of anthropology, this perspective is that of alterity. Any particular phenomena is considered and studied as an integral part of the sociocultural multiverse. Yet because this perspective must always be elaborated from the experience of a unique, concrete, historical reality, and because the basis of scientific knowledge is precisely the reality under observation, that particular reality not only forms part of the generation of knowledge, but also contributes to shaping the anthropological tradition of subdiscipline in question. The empirical field in which all social sciences develop is constantly changing, and anthropology this experience is so strong that it has become one of the cause of the discipline's cyclical crisis. Every so often, anthropology's practitioners fear the imminent disappearance of the phenomena their ancestors and classic authors dedicated themselves to understanding. But it must be taken into account that the sociocultural multiverse in which phenomena appears and disappear is, if not created by then, at least two ways shaped by the state in whose territory it is located. To make this statement is not to assign to the state its own essence. Rather, the state should be understood as a mechanism for configuring or filtering situations, and especially social problems. Sometimes the state itself generates these situations and problems. Sometimes it only ranks them, makes them explicit, or tries to disperse them, hide them, play them down, attend to them, or make them present in so-called public opinion, in expert circles, and in the actions of its apparatuses. Thus, the topics and the perception of those topics that anthropologists of a particular country take on as subjects of study, and to whose modification they sometimes try to contribute using the knowledge they generate about them, are established by and sustained by the concrete actions of state institutions. All of the foregoing suggests that in order to understand the configuration of any particular anthropological tradition, one must begin by considering the field of socio-political forces and rules in which the daily activities of the procedures, communicators, and use of the anthropological knowledge take place. This field is not merely the context for the generation of anthropological knowledge, but also another of its dimensions. For the preceding reasons, it is necessary to briefly describe the nation-state of Mexico in order to understand its anthropology as a generator of knowledge in the worldwide sociocultural mosaic. Mexico, a country of 2 million square kilometers with nearly 100 million inhabitants and several million more nationals living in the United States, is characterized by extreme social inequality in its economy, which ranks among the top 10 in the world. The legal minimum family wage in 2003 was equally to $4 per day. Although Mexico is predominantly mestizo demographically and culturally, and significant percentage of its population belongs to one of the 62 native ethno-linguistic groups that live in Mexican territory. Of the approximately 10 million inhabitants considered by the census to be indigenous, 2 million live in large cities. The rest live primarily in the rural zones of the center and south of the country, under conditions according to nearly every social indicator that place them at the base of the social pyramid. Excuse me. The third important characteristic of the country is its proximity to the world's principal superpower, which traditionally has exercised an enormous influence over Mexico, including its cultural environment. For example, a large number of the Mexican anthropologists who have completed academic degrees outside Mexico, as well as those who have taken sabbaticals or finished postdoctoral degrees, have done so in the United States until the recent past. There existed among the majority of intellectuals and in some spheres of the state of apparatus a certain non-nationalistic tendency, which as was the most clearly expressed in Mexico's relatively independent foreign policy. Mexico supported Cuba and the Nicaraguan Sandinistas and acted as mediator in the Salvadoran and Guatemalan civil wars. However, neither the predominant consumption patterns nor many other aspects of daily life in Mexico escaped the molding influence of the social and cultural norms generated in its powerful northern neighbor. The social and political consequences of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 make up a fourth of relevant feature. Not only was the 1917 Constitution one of the most progressive in the world when it was created, but it was also effectively established across more than 7 decades, and in spite of many manipulations and twists, an important union movement, and above all, educational and agricultural policies unique in Latin America. Finally, during the 20th century, Mexico remained free of national security governments. This marked the countries with a distinctive intellectual, political, scientific, and academic lifestyle, and fostered especially during the 20 most intense years of dictatorship in Central and South America. The arrival en masse of social scientists from other Latin American countries, some of them were even permanently incorporated into the Mexican academic community. Today, Mexican anthropology constitutes a large, well-consolidated disciplinary and professional field. Although its visibility in public opinion and policy has varied over time, the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, National Institute of Anthropology and History, or INAH, and to a lesser degree, the National Commission for the Development of the Indigenous, or CDI, until 2003 called the National Indigenous Institute, or INI, have always played important roles in this field. INAH controls almost all the archaeology in Mexico, administers the majority of history and ethnology museums, and is the source of employment for almost every archaeologist and many other anthropologists. Among the employees of CDI, professional anthropologists are a minority. 2 sets of statistics illustrate the current situation. The first is that Mexico currently has 19 programs offering bachelor's degrees in anthropology, 18 offering master's degrees, and 9 offering doctorates, to which can be added various graduate programs that the not formally anthropology programs, but which regularly allows students to write these of an anthropological character. Although the majority of these programs are concentrated in the country's capital, 1/3 of the 32 federal entities have at least one academic program, and several more are in preparation. Between 1998 and 2000, 672 bachelor's degrees, 235 master's degrees, and 98 doctorates were awarded in anthropology. The second is that in 2001, 29 scientific and general anthropological journals and annuals were being published in Mexico, along with a dozen specialized bulletins belonging to the different branches of anthropology. In addition, anthropologists in Mexico write regularly in good number of multidisciplinary and other social science journals, as well as in cultural supplements and even newspapers. Although the modern scientific Mexican anthropology has its roots in the political and social reordering provoked by the Mexican Revolution of 1910, it also forms yet another link in a tradition of thought that began with the Iberian invasion, namely reflection on the confrontation of the civilizations involved in that event. The landmark dispute in the 16th and 17th centuries over the human status of the inhabitants of the Americas and the consequent obligations of the colonial powers toward those inhabitants was in a sense the starting point for the Mexican anthropology in terms of its principal others, the indigenous peoples. These peoples would live out the centuries following the invasion, separated from the Spaniards and Creoles in their Indian republics, but in numerous social interstices, I don't know that word, I'm sorry. Above all urban ones, a demographic sector later called mestizo grew larger and larger, augmented by the descendants of enslaved Africans. The liberal discourse of independent Mexico did not distinguish among citizens on the basis of their ethnic roots. It did, however, legitimate the intent only partially successful, dissolving the geoeconomic basis of the indigenous societies through the exploration of their land. After the colonial power had almost totally destroyed all previously existed forms of socio-political organization, that land was possessed and worked under communal forms of organization. For this reason, and under the influence of positivist evolutionism, the intellectual precursors of the Mexican Revolution generally subsumed the indigenous population in the rural problem of this country, which they proposed to resolve through agrarian reform and the industrialization of the countryside. The Constitution that emanated from the Revolution, with its extraordinary for that period individual guarantees and social rights, made no mention of the indigenous population. Yet two of its most significant articles, those referring to the ownership of land and to education, became the two principal axes around which indigenous activity would spin. To those axes, because of widespread ignorance about the indigenous population, intense research was added as a third and emblematic initiative in this regard was the Action Research Project on the population of the Teotihuacan Valley, the primary results of which provided the first Mexican anthropologist, Manuel Gamio, with a doctorate in 1921. It was a project of regional orientation considered to be a pilot, and it consisted of first getting to know in detail and later improving the situation of the highly indigenous population. A retrospective described this sort of project as follows. Anthropology in Mexico was born really from a very vivid laceration sociocultural reality that still exists today. From this reality comes the application of the integral method, which contemplates the study of the population in its three stages of development: pre-Hispanic, colonial, and modern, to learn its historical origins and thereby to be in a condition to help the population in that way, in contrast to the other countries where anthropology or one of its branches served for colonial ends. In Mexico, it appears as a practice for the good or marginalized and traditionally exploited groups. Matos bis Moctezuma. Manuel Gamio had been a student of Franz Boas, who had played a decisive role in the initial stages of the International School of Archaeology and American Ethnology in Mexico City, which was interrupted by the events of the Revolution. Later, Gamio became the first head of the Department of Archaeology and Ethnography, created in 1917, which was not a branch of the education sector, but rather formed part of the Secretariat of Agricultural Development. Indigenism expanded during the popular nationalist presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, who laid the foundations for the development of anthropology in the country. In 1939, he founded INAH, which, besides being responsible for all archaeological sites in Mexico, has centers of administration and investigation throughout the country and carries out important editorial activities during the Cárdenas administration. Excuse me. The first Inter-American Indian Conference took place in 1940, and Patalcaro, Mexico, as a result of which two important institutions were established. The first was the Inter-American Indian Institute, an institution of the Organization of American States and editor of one of the oldest social science journals in Latin America, America Indigena, which was founded during the conference but really began to operate in 1942 in Mexico City. The second was the National Indigenous Institute, established in 1948. The first academic department of anthropology was created as early as 1938. It was incorporated into INAH in 1942 as the National School of Anthropology and History, ENAH. To this day, it is the most important center for anthropological training in Latin America. It offers at the levels of the licenciatura, master's, and doctoral degrees, all the subdisciplines of social anthropology, ethnology, physical anthropology, linguistics, ethnohistory, history, and archaeology. This anthropological science was designed to occupy itself with important tasks for the country, above all with studying and conserving Mexico's pre-Hispanic and colonial patrimony, and with examining and attending the precarious situation of the indigenous groups, whereas those who addressed the first of these tasks did so largely on a technical level, had no great theoretical pretensions, and were principally interested in shaping a panorama of ancient history. Those who took the second task widely assumed the theoretical orientation and methodology of so-called North American culturalism. That approach was supported through the translation of its principal works at a government publishing house and through diverse research programs directed by North American anthropologists. The emblematic figure of the epoch is González Aguirre Beltrán, 1908 to 96, a medical doctor turned ethnohistorian and social anthropologist who during his long life combined directorial positions in indigenous activity with prolific writing on the theoretical and practical aspects of the indigenism. According to his definition, indigenism was not policy formulated by Indians for the solutions of their own problems, but rather that non-Indians targeting the heterogeneous ethnic groups who receive the general distinction of indigenous. In contrast, the orientations of past generations, which Aguirre rejected as assimilationist or incorporationist, and accused of lacking respect for indigenous cultures as one of the roots of modern Mexican nation, he defined his position as integrationist in the sense of an induced acculturation. Consequently, it was an indigenism that adopted the ideology of the mestizo as the method and technique of national unification. With this goal, many indigenous coordination centers were founded, located in the Ladino urban nuclei of the so-called intercultural regions. They were to foment the slow incorporation of the indigenous population into national culture, principally through government actions in primary education, health, promotion of economic and communicational activities, and legal counsel in agrarian issues. Anthropological research would precede the establishment of such centers and would accompany the development of their activities. Yet at almost the same time, this original version of applied anthropology, which practically defined Mexican anthropology, reached its culmination during the federal administration of 1970 to 76, when Aguirre worked simultaneously as director of the INA and as subsecretary of the Secretary of Education. Critiques of this form of anthropology were also becoming stronger. These critiques incorporated the dependency theories and emerging in Latin America, the rejection of the U.S. imperialism, dissatisfaction with explanations of social reality that derive from the so-called superstructure, the postulate that any local phenomenon must be understood in the frame of global processes of exploitation and domination of the Third World, and the hope for near and radical transformation of Mexico's blatantly unjust social structures. Marxism became the articulating axis of what was frequently called critical anthropology, or engaged anthropology, which in a short time became hegemonic in the country. In an early manifesto, indigenism was denounced as an instrument of an unacceptable westernization and modernization of the indigenous, the goal of which was to eradicate the ethnic personality of the Indian. Against this, the right to self-determination for indigenous groups and the construction of a pluricultural state was demanded. Others later rejected indigenism as part of the capitalist project of dissolution of non-capitalist societies. The development of this critique, full of internal contradictions, as it was, and the search for alternative anthropologies were consolidated during a governmental period of nationalist and third worldist tendencies, and the intent manifested largely in a new agrarian law of reviving the revolutionary tradition dulled by the regimes following that of the Cardenas. As a result of all this, indigenous population mostly ceased to be a subject of study. When it was studied, it was seen almost exclusively from the angle of its belonging to the peasantry with which it seemed to share domestic and communal organization, submission to exploitation and domination, and the occasional protest. Simultaneously, the structural sphere, customs and language, religion and cosmovision, which traditionally had occupied a central place in anthropological work, was reduced to the epiphenomena of ideology and alienation, and at nearly the same time, the dizzying urbanization that over the course of the 1970s converted Mexico in a statistical term into a predominantly urban country, inspired a growing number of anthropologists to enter the fields of urban and labor anthropology. They brought with them the hope of finding in the mobilizations of these new social subjects the beginning of the long for social transformations, and they shared a conviction that they could contribute with their scientific study to that transformation. But even after Aguirre left the indigenous organizations, his conception prevailed inside them, although they were later assimilated into the fight against what was first called marginalization and later poverty. These phenomena were doubtless exasperated throughout the country by the neoliberal policies instrumental after the explosion of Mexico's foreign debt in 1982. In Mexico Profunda, Deep Mexico 1996, Guillermo Bonifil characterized the history of Mexico since the arrival of the Europeans as an unending battle between the Western and the Mesoamerican civilizations, and diagnosed the potential for updating the latter civilizations for the anthropological community. The book was called was a call to attention for having forgotten the indigenous population. It reminded anthropologists that indigenous people had to be taken into account if they were to adequately understand the complexity of Mexican society and to reconstruct it on a real basis of equality and freedom. Yet this Mexican anthropology's most successful book was unable to provoke a new indigenous policy, although it was a key point of reference in a brief interlude in which anthropologists attempted to promote a more participatory indigenism. It did contribute, in contrast, to the strengthening of Indianism and, in particular, to the self-esteem and mobilization of many indigenous organizations and intellectuals with whom Bonifil maintained close ties and whom he promoted through different media. It also contributed to cementing a more unique or more adequate concept of the indigenous problem. The book made it clear that the indigenous problem entailed a questioning of the national model of the country and was not an obstacle caused by the backwardness of a demographic minority. In the country's democratization, which grew stronger beginning in the mid-1980s and led for the first time to a candidate from an opposition parties winning the presidency of Mexico in 2000, the indigenous groups' situation and demands played practically no role whatsoever in 1992. Two controversial modifications to the Constitution brought them briefly back into the national limelight. On one hand, motivated by the International Labor Organization's Conventions 169 concerning indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries, and by preparations for the common commemoration of the 500 years of the American-European encounter, one addition to the Constitution made mention of the indigenous population for the first time in that document, recognizing it as the basis of the country's multiculturalism. On the other hand, modification of a different article put an end to the agrarian reform and made peasants' land vulnerable to market forces, permitting allocation of the ejidos, the most common form of land tenancy among the indigenous population, to the individuals, as well as the rent and sale of the ejido land. Finally, it was indigenous people themselves who demanded the country's attention on precisely the day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect on 1st January 1994. The Chipanican Zapatistas initiated their armed uprising. Its brief military phase and heavily publicized demands provoked over several years an intense debate over the situation of Mexico's indigenous people and the national project. It has also prompted a complicated process of negotiation between the rebels and the federal government, which remains unfinished even now. At the same time, indigenous policy began to break apart. On one hand, new programs were established and people of indigenous extraction were named to various directive posts. On the other hand, the number of uncoordinated indigenous agencies increased, the resources assigned to the indigenous apparatus were reduced, and the Inter-American Native American Indian Institute's activities were frozen. In the anthropological community, all these developments provoked an authentic boom in studies and events surrounding the varied and often very traditional topics related to the indigenous peoples, their cultures, and inter-ethnic relations in the country, as well as reflections on the pluricultural character of the nation. However, anthropologists' effort to systemize and share their knowledge with their specialists, political actors, the indigenous groups and movements, and the public in general still do not correspond to the country's objective needs. And few anthropologists are truly familiar with any of the indigenous cultures from whom they are separated by a language barrier, among others. In short, Mexican anthropology of the last 3 decades contrasts sharply with that of its first 4 decades as a modern science in the country. In its first stage, past and present indigenous groups were almost the only phenomena anthropologists studied, and the anthropological knowledge generated by about these internal others was tightly linked to a strategy of their further transformation directed by the state in the goal of completing the process of national formation. The second stage began with the eclipsing of this topic, but later, and in good measure due to mobilization by indigenous people themselves, the design of a model of the country and that permitted their incorporation as different peoples became one of the principal topics of anthropological research, and a perspective that permeated many other topics as well. The cultural class dialect. The history described in the previous section was interlaced with a sequence of hegemonic paradigmatic positions in Mexican anthropology. Over the near century of its existence as a scientific discipline, I have already commented on the strong influence that North American culturalism exercised over Mexican anthropology in its first phase. Yet this influence kindled not mere imitation, but rather a creative transformation of the culturalist theoretical orientation for the purposes of understanding the Mexican situation and illuminating the formation of a national culture. Toward this end, anthropologists greatly reduced the weight of the relativist component of the original theoretical formulation, and they combined that formulation with an evolutionist perspective, in which the nation-state constituted a universal stage, through one still not entirely achieved in Mexico. According to a concept of culture inherited from the 19th century, the nation in Mexico could be thought of as nothing but homogeneous, especially in its superstructural sphere. Just how strongly national unity and was understood as uniformity was still obvious in the late 1980s. When some Mexican anthropologists rejected the demand for indigenous autonomy, considering it unavoidably damaging to national integrity and sovereignty, and even dangerous for being potentially separatists, and thereby exploitable by the United States to weaken the country in the same way it had done in the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. At the same time, proponents of orthodox Marxist positions refused to recognize in non-capitalist forms of production anything except pre-capitalist survivals, and they objected that to the multilineal model of evolution, contrasting it as Aguirre had in his indigenism with the idea of the necessary conversion of the peasants and the indigenous population into proletarians. Because the preeminence of the National Institute of Anthropology and history of the National Indigenous Institute within the anthropological community, the union of the 4 traditional anthropological subdisciplines, nuanced by the addition of an important historical component, was maintained. The historical component had already been expressed in the conception of the first 19th century institution of importance for Mexican anthropology, the National Museum of Natural History, Archaeology, and History, founded in 1865, and it was constantly reinforced by the presence of archaeological vestiges everywhere by the colonial centers in the major cities, and by the state doctrine's insistence on the mestizo character of the Mexican people. The last was represented emblematically in the Plaza of the Three Cultures in Tlaxcala, where an inscription in stone defines the result of the final battle of 1521. It was neither triumph nor defeat. It was the painful birth of the mestizo people that makes up Mexico today. The protection and reconstruction of spectacular historical sites and buildings, the creation of en masse of archaeology, history, ethnology museums throughout the country, and the use of indigenistic policies to achieve the cultural homogenization of the nation contributed decisively to the consolidation of Mexican anthropology. It thereby gained itself a prominent place among the social science disciplines, an achievement rare even in those countries where anthropology was born. Regarding the real transformations achieved in the indigenous regions by what the Aguirre called the Mexican School of Anthropology, few of evaluations of these interventions exist outside the National Indigenous Institute's reports. Yet it is striking how many pilot projects were never converted into projects of regional transformation. This was primarily due to the 6-year rhythms of public administration, to the fact that the indigenous institutions were predominantly limited to tasks of coordination and not execution, and to regional elites' resistance to indigenous activity. Despite expressing occasional admiration for the builders of the pre-Hispanic pyramids and temples, the elites frequently felt threatened by potential or real demands from the descendants of those builders in respect to land, financing, and public services. In this context, we must remember that even today, the word Indian is used in Mexico more as an insult than as a plain denomination for one part of the population. In spite of the serious conflicts it caused, the critique of established anthropology that appeared in the late 1970s developed rapidly into a substitute for the previously predominant theoretical orientation, especially in the university institutions in the capital, keeping in mind that at the time there were only 2 anthropology schools in the rest of the country. Founded in 1957 and 1966 respectively, it led many Mexican anthropologists to distance themselves from indigenism, without, however, slowing down their engagement in other official agencies related to social policy. That the different branches of this new anthropology shared an interest in social structure and its precise position in dependent capitalism undoubtedly promoted greater attention to the previously little-known British and French social anthropology. But the general frame of debate and investigation was that of Marxism, at first rudimentary, mechanistic, and economistic, oriented by Soviet manuals, but later more flexible and influenced principally by then world-renowned French and Italian Marxist and Marxist anthropologists. The thinking of a long series of Marxists considered heterodox or renegade by the official Marxism era, as well as the ideas of a good number of Central and South American left-wing social scientists, not a few of whom lived for periods of time as exiles in Mexico, were also important. Neo-evolutionism and multilineal evolutionism, widely fused with Marxism, also played an important role, explainable by Mexican anthropology's traditional attention to historical processes of long duration, as well as by its capacity to join diverse theoretical anthropological currents. During those years, the opposition of the culturalism, which was often identified with North American cultural imperialism, was so strong that the word culture practicality disappeared from anthropological texts. Even studies as well known as the analysis of the media done in South America's southern cone during the 1970s, and the highly original critiques of capitalist ideology in general and the educational system in particular, such as those of Paulo Freire and Ivan Illich, motivated few concrete anthropological studies. Meanwhile, sociocultural aspects, until then heavily researched, such as language, family relationships, normative systems, and religion, were left to one side. This was probably an extreme consequence of the search for more suitable models of social analysis that would bring to light the multiple relations of exploitation and oppression and force in the country, which manifested themselves particularly crudely in the rural countryside. Not few anthropologists and students were tied in one form or another to political, social, and religious organizations and to movements of leftist orientation, although they escaped the repression common in the rest of the Latin America. They still remembered with the anguish the pre-Olympic massacre of 1968. In light of all this, it is not strange that the anthropology generated from the late 1970s until the late 1980s featured a strong tone of denunciation and social criticism, almost independent from the intentions or personal preferences of many of its practitioners. The non-existence of an industrial proletariat as the revolutionary subject predetermined by Marxist theory on one hand, and the fascinating Cuban and Chinese revolutionaries, together with the ups and downs of Latin American and Vietnam guerrillas on the other, turned the analysis of the rural population extremely mechanical, especially the debate over the future of the peasantry and is the seemingly endless controversy over the ascetic mode of production. In the 1980s, the word culture so slowly reappeared in the Mexican anthropology, prompted by Gramscian Marxism. The concept of popular culture permitted a fruitful connection between the discipline's typical micro-scale studies of urban barrios, rural to urban migrants, factory workers, and union movements on one hand, and a global frame of analysis from a class perspective on the other. As a result, the effective segmentation of work, daily life, political interests, and symbolic expressions in the largest sectors of the Mexican population came to light in increasing detail, and terms such as cultures of work and urban culture began to proliferate. At the same time, the analytical decontextualization of these social groups was avoided by maintaining a familiar, comprehensive theoretical scheme and the customary critique of the system. The significant advance in the decriminalization, democratizing of political life beginning in the mid-1980s contributed to raising scholars' interest in the superstructural sphere, in the subjectivity of social actors, and consequently in the field of political culture. Anthropologists also began to pay some attention to indigenous populations again, although for a long time only as part of the popular cultures. Since 1980, the institutional growth of the Mexican anthropology has been continuous. Research centers have been founded, universities have been opened, departments of anthropology, almost always social anthropology, and the numbers of museums and long-term archaeological projects have grown. Graduate degrees have multiplied. In the early 1970s, there existed only one master's degree and one doctoral degree program, both at a private university. All of Mexico's anthropological institutions have benefited from increases in full-time faculty positions and from the relative ease with which conferences can now be organized, and written works of all types published. Importantly, however, almost no anthropological libraries deserving of the name exist outside the capital, and no university has managed to gather a base of materials on any one theme. Not even on the indigenous groups of its region, that would enable scholars to avoid going to foreign universities for any significant research in anthropology or history. Moreover, a large percentage of the research done, even in academic institutions, is limited to ethnographic description or historical inventory. Since the beginning of the 1990s, a somewhat disturbing, internally contradictory panorama has appeared. In the first set of contrasts, the presence of anthropology, especially of social anthropology, ethnology, in academic institutions, on one hand, continues to grow and gain strength. Programs offering graduate degrees, in particular, continue to multiply and frequently attract professionals from other disciplines, social as well as medical and agricultural. On the other hand, a silent transformation of the university system following the overall dictates a neoliberalism and the criteria of efficiently and productivism is leading to a decline in the importance of fieldwork, especially in teaching programs. It is also the reason many professors, most of whom represent the first generation in their family with an academic degree, have been pushed to organize their activists according to the rationality of productivism. Yet the anthropological community has made no organized response to this matter, which is highly relevant for the conception of and future of science and scientific research. A second paradox is that, on one hand, the number of publications coming out of Mexican anthropology, books as well as periodicals, is growing, and they are often have high quality. In this way, reflection about Mexican anthropology has also been augmented. Yet, on the other hand, the infrastructure of the majority of Mexico's research and teaching centers does not even permit scholars to collect and familiarize themselves with the anthropological knowledge generated in their own country, much less that stemming from the rest of Latin America, the Caribbean, or other parts of the global South. In a third contrast, although the presence of anthropologists in diverse areas of public administration and national political debate remains strong, the weakness of profession-based organizations has made it impossible for them to join forces to coordinate in any internal debate or direct one towards society at large. In addition, a divide is growing between on one side, anthropologists who work in academic institutions and tend to assume that they represent the entirety of Mexican anthropology, and on the other hand, those who work in state administration and frequently penetrate in creative ways both the public and private sectors, including the growing sector of non-governmental organizations. In this context, the contrast between the political contents of many anthropological discussions carried out in general society and the depoliticization of university institutions also merits attention. A fourth paradox is that, on one hand, an increasingly rich variety of topics is available for research and publication. Some matters that went uninvestigated for years, such as religion, the culture, nature, relationship, life in the big cities, and art, now have a fixed place. A newer topics such as relations between genders and generations, migrations and political cultures, and juridical anthropology have been added. On the other hand, all these investigations are carried out and written works published with almost no contact between researchers and without debate, as is evidenced, for example, by the absence of critical reviews of writings and events. Finally, Mexican anthropology's definitive recuperation of the concept of culture, that important identifier of the discipline, can be highlighted as the characteristic trait of doubtless significance. Although there is no uncontested hegemony, a semiotic approach seems to predominate. Consequently, the superstructural angle, politics, law, religion, and communication, also prevails with the respect to the indigenous topic. Paradoxically, what the first manifesto of the Zapatista movement denounced as the undeclared genocidal war against our peoples, as well as the socio-economic component of their demands for work, land, roof, health, food, education, independence, liberty, democracy, justice, and peace for all Mexican people, Comendencia General, is left out of the line of vision. Could it really be said that the concept of culture, which was to correct the economistic and mechanistic narrowness of the sociologistic and objectivistic vision previously in vogue, in the end did not remedy the narrowness, but became merely a substitute for it? In effect, whereas before references to social class and the class struggle, imperialism and revolution were almost obligatory, one now finds mention of difference, diversity, globalization, and intercultural dialogue. Perspective on the identity of Mexican anthropology. I hope I have shown that Mexican anthropological science has been so closely tied on various levels to the Mexican sociocultural and political system that it would be impossible to understand anthropology without reference to that system. The presence of indigenous peoples whose has been and continues to be defining for Mexican anthropology. Certainly it gives the term multiculturally and significantly different meaning in Mexico as in all Latin America, from that in Europe and the United States. Since the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century, these others have presented a problem of knowledge and of political and social action. At first, the colonists solved this problem by assigning indigenous people the sort of subordinated coexistence typically of every colonial order. The liberalism of the 19th century then decreed that, or the problems in existence, the post-revolutionary regime recognized it anew as a problem of national transition, for which reason it was not included in the Constitution, and fomented the establishment of anthropology as an instrument to diagnose the indigenous people's situation, starting from their most ancient antecedents, and to distinguish between what was conservable, which was little according to Gaimio, and more for Aguirre, and what had to be suppressed. In that manner, indigenism was born as an original creation of research action that was oriented more by anthropology's origins. The concept, let me get this up, of the nation in the 19th century than by the model of Indian white or black-white relations in the country where relativistic culturalism originated. In this sense, all of the most original theoretical formulations developed by Mexican anthropologists in the 20th century, from the Aguirre's concept of acculturation as a universal process and a strategy of social policy to Bonfil's model of the battle of two civilizations, in addition to different understandings of the peasant mode of production, shared and equally original, although not always explicit, multilineal evolutionistic vision on one hand, the possibility of a unique Mexican route to modernity, and on the other hand, the existence of a diversity of modernities. One also can find in this evolutionary multilinearity the diverse intentions of Mexican anthropologists to identify a Mexican anthropological tradition in whose beginnings the places of Montaigne and Hobbes, Rousseau and Herder are occupied by Bernardino de Sahagún and Bartolomé de las Casas, José de Acosta and Francisco Javier Clavier. Yet in Mexican teachings programs, Mexican anthropology, in isolation from other Latin American and Caribbean anthropologists, is presented more as an annex to or simple adaptation of the dominant anthropology, which is seen as universally. Concurrently, the occasional publication of Mexican anthropological texts in foreign journals of international circulation, of all of which are published in the countries where anthropology originated, is sometimes more of a mark of certification than a participation in the global process of communication. The names of the precursors of Mexican anthropology show modern anthropological science to be the most recent link in 5 centuries of intellectual effort to clarify and define the collective identity born in New Spain. This task is far from being merely an intellectual enterprise ever since the first Creoles and the instigators of Mexican independence undertook it. The matter of identity has been of immediate political relevance as it continues to be in decisions about the country's educational, scientific, and technological systems, and in respect to the 10 million Mexican-born residents of the United States. The task can directly affect those who undertake it, sometimes in terms of personal identity, as when one discovers in one's own culture or even in one's own family history, one of the roots of Mexican culture sometimes affects people in terms of expanded or diminished employment opportunities, as when one begins to legislate on linguistic rights, and when political cultural terms, the task always affects those who undertake it, as when one discusses the redefinition of the project of nation building. If pending legal reforms were to advance in a serious manner, then the task of defining Mexico's collective identity would also affect people in economic terms, because scant public budgets would have to be redistributed in a new way. The general malaise in the social sciences in many places, sometimes identified with and sometimes promoted by discourses on globalization and on the alleged end of the grand narratives, influences Mexican anthropology too. But uncertainty about the future of democracy in the country weighs heavily today as well. Beyond Mexico's economic problems and beyond the problems democracy is facing in other parts of the world, an entire generation which pushed for and finally achieved a system more or less free of political parties, with effective vote counts, alternation in the principal positions of public administration, and the first steps toward a redefinition of the relationship between the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, seems fatigued in the face of demands for inculturation, indigenization of the doctrine of human rights. It also seems fatigued in view of the conversion of demands for respect for indigenous cultures into demands for just and practicable laws and regulations. This generation seems weary of the uneven dissemination of the values of transparency, accountability, and critical participation among the social spheres. There are plenty of uncertainties about the meaning, role, and future of the state. In this context, the parallel between the history of Mexican anthropology and that of the hegemonic anthropology portrayed in the textbooks generally used in Mexico demands attention. The hegemonic anthropology has endured in the wake of its original paradigm of 19th century evolutionism, repeated transformations of such breadth that they can be described only as ruptures. Structural, functional anthropology, diffusionism, and culturalism were understood as refoundations of the discipline, just as Marxism would be half a century later and the 3 decades after that. The neo-Boasian anthropology is also sometimes called postmodern. Mexican anthropology too has known substitutions of this type. Curiously, unlike the first radical challenge of indigenism, which corresponded to a generational change, the recent eclipsing of Marxism was carried out without a generational change and almost without controversy. In the past decades, controversies about the dependent development of the country included the topics of the rules of cognitive characteristics of anthropological science, of its social function, and its insertion into a world scene marked by cultural imperialism. Today, this type of discussion is nearly extinct. This is the last partially due to Mexican social scientist acceptance without real questioning of the external and internal pressures they feel to make their activities conform with supposedly universal productivist canons, a conformity demanded and in many forms by the national educational apparatus since the 1990s. Apparently, this situation has reinforced the fact that in Mexican anthropology, the topic of its changing influence on the rest of Latin America, in reaction to which other parts of the South have criticized Mexican anthropology in much of the same way that Mexican anthropologists have criticized the powerful anthropologies of the North, seems to never to have posed any concern at all. In this context, it is interesting to note some indications that Mexican anthropology, independently of its theoretical perspectives or specific institutional insertions may soon have to subject itself to a type of critical judgment that until now was thought necessary only for the hegemonic anthropology of the North. This is so because to the degree that some indigenous cultures continue their revitalization, more observations of the type made by a Mayan ethnolinguist could emerge with respect to Mexican anthropology as practiced by non-indigenous people. Our denominators, by means of anthropological discourse, have reserved for themselves the almost exclusive right to speak for us. Only very recently have we begun to have access to this field of knowledge and to express our own word. The final comment. The trajectory and current situation of Mexican anthropology are as unique as those of any other country, of any other national or linguistic, cultural, anthropological community. That is a tongue twister, I'm sorry. This anthropological tradition was not formed as the immediate effect of a simple dissemination from the main countries where the universal anthropological science originated nearly a century and a half ago. Rather, as a result of a diverse array of both exogenous and endogenous impulses, among which the diffusion of European and North American anthropology has played a fundamental role, Mexican anthropology has molded itself via a constant search to understand and to act upon the country's social-cultural diversity, which has served until now as its principal object of study. Similar observations would ring true in any place where native anthropologists have made their appearance. Native anthropologists who, in contrast with other anthropologists, principally studied their own societies, Boivin, Rosado, and Arribas, a systematic inventory and comparison of the anthropologies of the South would reveal more clearly their characteristics, their weaknesses, and their potential. This does not suggest that these anthropologies are totally distant from or necessarily opposed to Northern anthropologies, instead clarifying the properties of the diverse anthropologies of the South, whose societies of origin formed part of their initial anthropological program as objects of study, would help clear a path toward a new conception of a universal anthropology in which differences do not necessarily lead to hierarchical divisions, but rather are accepted as variations on a common base, as occurs, for example, in the cases of French and English anthropology. In this way, the universal anthropological tradition would accept the historical challenge of assuming for itself the essential trait of the human reality it studies to be one and diverse at the same time. Here are the notes. I don't know if you can see that. And this is the end of this excerpt. Thank you.